He thought humiliating her in front of everyone would make him untouchable, but in less than 10 seconds, the entire hallway would remember his name for a very different reason. The first time Emily Carter walked through the front doors of Westbrook High, nobody noticed anything special about her, and that was exactly how she wanted it. Her steps were quiet, measured, almost calculated, as if she had already mapped out every inch of the building before ever setting foot inside. Her light brown hair was tied back in a simple ponytail, her clothes plain and unremarkable, the kind you'd forget seconds after seeing them. She moved past rows of lockers and clusters of students without making eye contact, her gaze fixed just ahead, steady and unreadable. To everyone else, she looked like another transfer student trying not to stand out, another quiet girl hoping to survive high school unnoticed. But what no one knew, what no one could have guessed from the way she kept her shoulders slightly lowered and her voice barely above a whisper, was that Emily wasn't avoiding attention out of fear. She was choosing her silence. And in a place like Westbrook High, silence didn't go unnoticed for long. Jake Reynolds leaned casually against a row of lockers near the center hallway, his presence impossible to ignore. At 6 feet tall with a confident posture that bordered on arrogance, he carried himself like someone who had never once been told no. Around him, a small circle of friends laughed a little louder when he spoke, moved a little quicker when he gestured, as if orbiting a center of gravity they didn't fully understand but didn't dare challenge. Jake had built his reputation on one simple rule: find the quiet ones, the ones who wouldn't push back, and remind them where they stood. It wasn't about anger. It wasn't even personal. It was a performance, one he had perfected over years, and the hallway was his stage. When his eyes landed on Emily that morning, walking alone with her head slightly down, something in his expression shifted. Not curiosity, recognition. He had seen her type before. Or at least, he thought he had. New girl, one of his friends muttered under his breath. Jake smirked faintly, straightening just enough to get a better look as Emily passed by without acknowledging anyone. No hesitation. No reaction. Just silence. That, more than anything, caught his attention. Because in his world, silence wasn't strength. It was an invitation. Emily could feel it, even without looking. The subtle shift in the air, the way conversations dimmed just slightly as she moved through the hallway, the weight of someone's attention following her steps. But she didn't speed up. She didn't glance back. Her breathing remained steady, her pace unchanged, as if she had already decided how this would play out long before this moment ever arrived. Somewhere behind her, a locker door slammed a little louder than necessary, followed by a ripple of laughter. Jake pushed himself off the lockers, his footsteps slow and deliberate as he stepped into her path just ahead. For a brief second, time seemed to narrow, the noise of the hallway fading into the background as two completely different worlds collided in a single space. He looked at her the way people look at something they believe they already understand. Emily looked back, her eyes calm, steady, giving nothing away. And in that quiet, unnoticed exchange, the line had already been drawn. The hallway did not explode into chaos the way people imagine moments like this should. Instead, it settled into something far more dangerous, a quiet tension that stretched thin across every locker and tile as students slowed their steps just enough to watch without appearing obvious. Because everyone at Westbrook High understood one unspoken rule. When Jake Reynolds stopped in front of someone, something was about to happen. Jake tilted his head slightly, studying Emily with the kind of casual confidence that came from never being challenged, his expression almost amused, as if he had already decided how this interaction would end before it even began. "You knew here," he said, not as a question but as a statement, his voice just loud enough to draw attention from nearby students who immediately leaned into the moment. Emily stopped walking, not abruptly, not nervously, but with a controlled stillness that felt deliberate, her backpack resting lightly on one shoulder as she met his gaze without hesitation, without attitude, just steady. "Yes," she replied, her voice calm, even, offering nothing more than the bare minimum. That alone was enough to shift something in the air. Most people in her position would have filled the silence, tried to explain themselves, tried to soften the moment, but Emily did not. And Jake noticed. A faint smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth as he took a step closer, closing the space between them in a way that was not aggressive, not overtly threatening, but intentional enough that everyone watching could feel the imbalance. You should probably learn how things work around here, he continued, glancing briefly at his friends as if inviting them into the performance, their quiet chuckles reinforcing the rhythm he had created. A locker door clicked shut somewhere down the hall, the sound echoing longer than it should have, and then fading into that same heavy silence. Emily did not move. She did not step back, did not shift her weight, did not even adjust her grip on the strap of her backpack. If anything, she seemed more grounded, more present, as if she had already accepted this moment for what it was and decided not to give it more than it deserved. Jake's eyes narrowed just slightly, not in anger, but in curiosity now, because there was something off about her response, or rather, her lack of one. He had seen fear. He had seen defiance. He had seen people try to laugh it off. But this quiet composure, felt different. Still, patterns were patterns, and Jake had built his confidence on the certainty that they always held. He reached out, not forcefully, not violently, but with a casual assumption of control, his hand brushing against the strap of Emily's backpack, as if to stop her from continuing forward, a simple gesture, one that would usually be enough to establish dominance without needing anything more. A few students nearby exchanged glances, some shifting uncomfortably, others watching with that familiar mix of curiosity and anticipation, because they had seen this scene play out before, just with different faces. Emily's eyes dropped briefly to his hand, then lifted back to his face, her expression unchanged, but something subtle had shifted, something almost imperceptible, like a line being quietly acknowledged. For the first time, Jake hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, a pause so small most people would have missed it, but it was there. Because in that moment, standing in the center of a crowded hallway that had gone unnaturally still, it became clear that Emily was not reacting the way she was supposed to. And sometimes, the most dangerous thing about a person is not what they do, but what they choose not to do. The air held its breath, waiting, as if even the building itself understood that whatever came next would not follow the script everyone had come to expect. For a moment that felt longer than it should have, nothing moved, not Jake, not Emily, not even the students gathered just close enough to pretend they were not watching, because something in the air had shifted from casual tension into something sharper, something uncertain. Jake's hand remained lightly on the strap of Emily's backpack, but the confidence behind that gesture had changed, not gone, but questioned, as if some instinct he could not explain was telling him that this situation was no longer as simple as it had been a second ago. He tightened his grip just slightly, not enough to be obvious, just enough to reassert control, or at least remind himself that he still had it. "You did not hear me," he said, his tone still calm, but now carrying an edge that had not been there before, the kind that came when control did not immediately return the way it always had. A few students shifted their weight, glancing between each other, sensing the subtle change but not fully understanding it. Emily's eyes dropped once more to his hand, then back up, and this time, there was something different in her gaze, not anger, not fear, but recognition, as if a boundary had just been clearly defined. Slowly, deliberately, she reached up and adjusted the strap of her backpack, her movement smooth and controlled, not pulling away, not reacting, simply reclaiming what was hers without urgency. Jake felt it, the quiet resistance, the refusal to play the role he had assigned her, and it unsettled him more than any outburst would have. His friends were still watching, their expectation hanging in the space behind him, waiting for the familiar next step, the laugh, the escalation, the moment that would confirm his dominance. But that moment did not arrive. Instead, there was silence, and in that silence, something uncomfortable began to grow. "You think you are different or something," Jake added, his voice slightly louder now, trying to pull the attention back into a direction he understood, trying to reshape the scene into something predictable again. A faint ripple of laughter followed, but it was thinner. This time, less certain. Emily did not respond right away. She held his gaze, steady, unshaken, and for the first time since this interaction began, she spoke with just enough clarity to cut through the noise around them. "I think you should let go," she said, her voice still calm, still even, but now carrying a quiet authority that did not match the image anyone had formed of her in the past few minutes. The hallway seemed to narrow again, conversations fading completely as nearby students leaned in without realizing it, drawn into a moment that no longer felt like a performance, but something real, something unpredictable. Jake let out a short breath through his nose, almost a laugh, but not quite, as if he could not decide whether to be amused or annoyed. No one talked to him like that. Not here, not in front of everyone. And yet, here she was, not raising her voice, not making a scene, just stating something as if it were obvious, as if it were already decided. He did not move his hand. If anything, he held it there a second longer than necessary, as if proving a point that now only he believed in. But the longer that second stretched, the more it became clear that something had shifted beyond his control. Because Emily was not reacting the way she was supposed to. She was not shrinking, not apologizing, not trying to escape. She was waiting. And there is a difference between someone who is silent because they are afraid, and someone who is silent because they are ready. The hallway held its breath once more, and this time, even Jake could feel it, that quiet, undeniable sense that whatever happened next would not belong to him. The silence did not break all at once. It fractured slowly, like something invisible pressing down on the hallway until even the smallest sound fell out of place. A locker clicking shut, a shoe shifting against the floor, a breath held just a second too long. Jake's jaw tightened, not because he felt threatened, but because he felt watched in a way he was not used to, as if the script had slipped from his hands and he could not quite grab it back. Emily's words still hung in the air, simple, calm, but undeniable, and for the first time, Jake realized that ignoring them would not make them disappear. "You think you can tell me what to do," he said, his voice carrying a sharper edge now, louder, meant to re-establish the space he had always controlled, but it did not land the same way it usually did. The laughter behind him came late, uncertain, like an echo that had lost its source. Emily did not raise her voice. She did not step back. She simply stood there, steady, grounded, her posture relaxed but not passive, her eyes locked on his with a clarity that made everything else in the hallway feel distant. "I am not telling you anything," she replied, her tone even, measured, as if she were stating something obvious rather than challenging him. "I am giving you a choice." The words settled heavier than anything he had heard all morning. A choice. That was not how this worked. Jake had spent years making sure people did not have choices around him, not real ones, not in moments like this. And yet, standing there now, with dozens of eyes quietly fixed on the space between them, it felt like the ground beneath that certainty was beginning to shift. He let out a short breath, glancing briefly to the side as if checking for support, for confirmation that this was still his moment, but what he saw did not match what he expected. Some students looked uncomfortable. Others were watching more closely than before, not entertained, not amused, but attentive, like they were waiting to see something they did not fully understand yet. When his gaze returned to Emily, she had not moved, not an inch. That was when something deeper than irritation flickered in his chest, something unfamiliar, something that did not belong to the version of himself he had built in this hallway. "You are in the wrong place if you think things work like that," he said, quieter now, but more controlled, trying to pull the moment back into something manageable. Emily's expression did not change, but there was a subtle shift in her presence, like a switch had been flipped somewhere beneath the surface. "No," she said softly. "I think you are used to people not finishing what they start." The words did not sound like an accusation. They sounded like an observation, and that made them harder to ignore. Jake's hand, still resting on the strap of her backpack, suddenly felt heavier, like it no longer belonged there, like it had crossed into a space it did not understand. For a fraction of a second, he considered pulling it away, ending this, resetting the moment before it went any further. But the hallway was watching. His friends were watching. And pride, that quiet, stubborn force, held him in place longer than he should have stayed. Emily noticed it, not with a change in expression, but with the slightest shift in her breathing, slow, controlled, as if she had been here before, as if she recognized this exact moment, the hesitation, the decision, the point where everything could still go one way or another. And in that suspended second, where nothing had happened yet, but everything was about to, it became clear that this was no longer about a joke, or attention, or control. This was about a boundary that had been crossed, and whether or not it would be respected. The hallway did not move. The air did not change. But something deeper settled into place, quiet and certain, as if the outcome had already been decided long before anyone realized they were part of it. The moment stretched just long enough for everyone to feel it. That fragile edge where something small could still turn back, where a single decision could dissolve the tension and let the hallway return to its usual noise and motion. But Jake did not step away. Instead, he shifted his stance slightly, squaring his shoulders as if reminding himself who he was in this space, who he had always been, and more importantly, who everyone expected him to be. "You talk like you know something," he said, forcing a faint smile that did not quite reach his eyes, his voice carrying just enough volume to pull the attention of those still pretending not to watch. A few of his friends laughed again, louder this time, trying to fill the silence that had begun to feel uncomfortable, unnatural. Emily remained exactly where she was, her posture unchanged, her breathing steady, her gaze unwavering, as if none of this had the power to move her unless she allowed it. That was the part Jake could not understand, could not control, and it pressed against him in a way that made his confidence feel thinner than before. He tightened his grip on the strap of her backpack for just a brief second, not enough to be obvious, just enough to reassert something, anything. But even that small action felt different now, like it no longer belonged in this moment. Emily noticed it, not with a reaction, but with a shift so subtle it would have gone unseen by anyone not looking directly at her. Her shoulders aligning just slightly, her stance grounding into the floor beneath her feet, as if preparing for something that had already been decided. "I do not need to know anything," she said quietly, her voice calm but firm, cutting cleanly through the low murmurs around them. "I just need you to understand." The hallway seemed to hold its breath again, but this time it felt heavier, more final, as if the space itself was waiting for something inevitable. Jake's expression flickered, irritation mixing with something he did not want to name, something that felt too close to doubt, and for a split second, his hand hesitated where it rested, the tension in his fingers no longer matching the certainty he had walked in with. He could end this now. He could step back, laugh it off, let the moment dissolve before it shifted any further. But the weight of expectation, the eyes on him, the version of himself he had spent years building, all of it pressed him forward instead of pulling him back. "Or what?" he asked, the words coming out sharper than intended, more defensive than dominant, though he did not realize it. Emily's eyes did not change, but something in them settled, something quiet and absolute, like a decision that had just reached its final point. "Or you are going to wish you had," she replied, not as a threat, not with anger, but with a calm certainty that did not need to raise its voice to be heard. The words did not echo. They did not need to. They landed exactly where they were meant to, and for the first time since this began, Jake felt the moment slip completely out of his control. Around them, the hallway had gone completely still, conversations fading into silence, students frozen mid-step, as if everyone instinctively knew that whatever came next would not be undone. Emily's hand moved then, not fast, not aggressive, just precise, reaching up toward the strap of her backpack where his hand still lingered, her motion smooth and deliberate, reclaiming her space without hesitation. And in that exact instant, before anything else could happen, before anyone could react, before Jake could decide what to do next, the balance of the entire moment shifted, quietly, completely, and irreversibly, as if the outcome had been waiting for this single point all along. It happened so quickly that most of the hallway did not register the exact moment things changed. Only that 1 second Jake was in control, and the next, something invisible had shifted beneath his feet, something that could not be taken back. Emily's hand did not strike, did not lash out. It simply moved with quiet precision, guiding his hand away from her backpack in a motion so controlled it felt almost effortless, yet firm enough that there was no misunderstanding. It was not forceful. It was final. Jake blinked, caught off guard not by pain or aggression, but by the sudden absence of control, the unexpected realization that the contact he had initiated no longer belonged to him. Before he could react, before he could reassert himself, Emily had already taken a half step forward, not into him, not challenging, but reclaiming her space completely, her posture straightening just enough to make it clear that the dynamic between them had changed. The hallway, already quiet, seemed to fall into a deeper stillness, the kind that settles when something undeniable has just occurred. Jake opened his mouth, ready to respond, ready to pull the moment back into something familiar, but the words did not come out the way he expected. Because for the first time, he was not sure what to say. His friends, who had been so quick to laugh moments ago, were now silent, their expressions shifting from amusement to confusion as they tried to understand what they had just witnessed. It had not looked like a confrontation. It had not sounded like one. And yet, something about it felt decisive, as if a line had been drawn and crossed in a way they could not easily explain. Emily did not raise her voice. She did not linger in the moment. She simply looked at Jake, her eyes calm, steady, carrying a quiet clarity that made everything else in the hallway feel distant. "I gave you a choice," she said softly, not as a warning, not as a threat, but as a statement of fact, as if the outcome had always depended on something simple that had already passed. Jake's jaw tightened, his pride pushing against the unfamiliar feeling rising in his chest, the one he refused to name, the one that did not fit into the version of himself he had built in front of everyone. He took a small step back, not enough to be obvious, but enough that those watching noticed, enough that the space between him and Emily was no longer something he controlled. And that was when it hit him, not all at once, but in a quiet, undeniable realization that whatever he had expected from this moment, whatever reaction he had planned for, had already slipped away. Around them, students exchanged glances, their understanding catching up to what they had just seen, the subtle shift in power that had taken place without noise, without chaos, without the kind of scene they were used to. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. But it was clear. Jake looked at Emily again, searching for something he could push against, something he could use to regain control, but there was nothing there for him to take. Only calm, only certainty. And in that stillness, in that absence of fear or reaction, he understood something he had never needed to consider before. Some people do not need to fight to end a fight. Emily adjusted her backpack strap once more, now untouched, now entirely her own, and without another word, she stepped past him, her movement smooth, unhurried, as if the moment behind her had already closed. No one stopped her. No one spoke. The hallway remained silent as she walked away, leaving behind a space that felt different than before, heavier, quieter, more aware. Jake stood there for a second longer than he should have, the weight of dozens of eyes pressing against him, not with laughter, not with admiration, but with something else, something unfamiliar. And in that quiet, he realized that whatever had just happened, it was not something he could undo, not with words, not with presence, not with anything he had relied on before. Because for the first time, the silence in the hallway did not belong to him. Emily did not look back as she walked down the hallway, her steps steady, unhurried, as if nothing unusual had just happened, but behind her, the silence did not follow her. It stayed, lingering in the space she had left behind, pressing down on every student who had witnessed the moment. For a few seconds, no one moved, no one spoke, as if the entire hallway needed time to catch up to what had just unfolded. Then slowly, almost reluctantly, the noise began to return, but it was different now, quieter, fragmented, filled with low murmurs instead of laughter. Jake remained where he stood, his posture still upright, his expression carefully neutral, but the absence of his usual confidence was impossible to ignore, even if no one said it out loud. One of his friends shifted beside him, glancing at him as if waiting for a reaction, for a joke, for something that would restore the balance they were used to, but Jake did not give them anything. He simply stared in the direction Emily had gone, his mind replaying the moment in a way that did not make sense to him, because there had been no struggle, no resistance, nothing he could point to and dismiss. It had been quiet, too quiet, and that made it harder to shake. What was that? One of his friends muttered under his breath, not mocking, not amused, just confused. Jake did not answer right away. His jaw tightened slightly, his eyes narrowing as if trying to reconstruct the situation into something familiar, something he could control again. But every version he replayed led to the same conclusion. Something had slipped, something he could not immediately fix. Down the hallway, Emily reached her locker, her fingers moving calmly as she entered the combination, the metallic click sounding louder than usual in her ears. though her expression remained unchanged. If anything, she looked exactly as she had when she first walked into the building, quiet, composed, unremarkable to anyone not paying attention. A girl standing alone, adjusting her books, preparing for the next class. But the difference was not in how she looked. It was in how the hallway now saw her. A few students nearby glanced in her direction, quickly looking away when she did not acknowledge them, unsure of what to make of her, unsure of how to place her in the invisible hierarchy they had always followed without question. One girl whispered something to her friend, her voice barely audible, but the tone carried curiosity instead of judgment. Back near the center of the hallway, Jake finally shifted his weight, taking a slow breath as if grounding himself, his shoulders squaring again, trying to rebuild the version of himself that had always worked before. It was nothing, he said, his voice firm, dismissive, the way it always was when he needed to close a moment before it grew into something else. But the words did not carry the same weight. Not this time. His friends nodded, some too quickly, some more cautiously, accepting the explanation because it was easier than questioning it. But the uncertainty remained, subtle, unspoken, settling into the space between them. As the bell rang, echoing through the halls, students began to move again, conversations picking up, footsteps filling the space, the school returning to its usual rhythm, but something beneath that surface had changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough. Emily closed her locker and turned, her eyes scanning briefly down the hallway, not searching, not concerned, just aware, as if measuring the space around her in a way no one else did. And for a brief second, her gaze passed over Jake, not lingering, not challenging, simply acknowledging his presence before moving on. That was all it took. Jake felt it, that quiet recognition, not of who he was, but of what had just happened, and in that fleeting moment, he understood something he had never needed to consider before. Respect is not something you take. It is something you can lose in an instant. And as Emily walked toward her next class, blending once again into the flow of students, the hallway carried a new kind of silence, not empty, not uncertain, but aware, as if everyone had just learned something they did not expect to learn that day. By the time the last bell of the day rang, the story had already traveled farther than Emily ever intended, moving quietly from locker to locker, from whispered conversations in classrooms to hushed exchanges in the cafeteria, growing not louder but sharper with each retelling, because no one could quite explain what had happened, only that something had changed. Emily sat near the window in her final class, her notebook open, her pen moving steadily across the page as if the day had unfolded like any other, her posture relaxed, her expression calm, giving no indication that she had become the center of attention in a place where attention was usually loud and obvious. A few seats away, two students leaned toward each other, their voices low, glancing in her direction before quickly looking away, unsure if she had noticed, unsure if they wanted her to. The teacher continued the lesson at the front of the room, unaware, or perhaps choosing not to acknowledge the subtle shift in the atmosphere. The way the class seemed just a little more focused, a little more aware of something unspoken. Across the building, Jake sat in a different classroom, his usual posture unchanged, his presence still commanding in appearance, but something beneath it had shifted in a way that could not be easily covered. He stared at the front of the room, but his focus was elsewhere, replaying the moment again, not searching for what she had done, but for what he had missed. It bothered him more than anything else, not the outcome, not the attention, but the fact that he had not seen it coming. That was not how things worked for him. One of his friends leaned over slightly, keeping his voice low. "People are talking," he said, not accusatory, not mocking, just stating a fact that both of them already understood. Jake did not respond immediately. He did not need to. He already knew. The difference was not in what people were saying, but in how they were saying it. There was no laughter, no exaggeration, just a quiet acknowledgement that something had happened that did not fit the pattern they were used to. After class, the hallway filled again, the usual rush of students heading toward exits, buses, and parking lots, but the energy remained different, less chaotic, more observant, as if everyone was paying attention in a way they had not before. Emily moved through the crowd with the same steady pace, her backpack resting comfortably on her shoulder, her eyes forward, not avoiding anyone, not seeking anyone out. A few students stepped slightly aside as she passed, not dramatically, not intentionally, but enough to create space, enough to show that something had shifted in how she was perceived. Near the exit doors, a voice called out softly, "Emily," hesitant, uncertain. She paused, turning slightly to see a girl she did not recognize standing a few feet away, her expression cautious but sincere. You did not have to say anything," the girl said, stumbling slightly over her words, as if unsure how to express what she had seen. Emily studied her for a brief moment, not with suspicion, not with judgment, just with quiet attention. "Sometimes not saying anything is exactly the point," she replied, her voice calm, steady, leaving the meaning open without explaining it further. The girl nodded slowly, as if understanding something she could not quite put into words. Emily gave a small, polite nod in return and turned back toward the doors, stepping outside into the late afternoon light where the noise of the school faded behind her. Back inside, Jake lingered near the lockers, his usual group around him. The conversation moving forward, jokes returning, the surface of everything trying to reset, but every so often, a glance would pass between them, a pause too long, a silence too noticeable, reminders that something had changed whether they acknowledged it or not. Jake leaned back against the lockers, arms crossed, his expression neutral, controlled, but his eyes no longer carried the same certainty. Because for the first time, the space around him did not feel guaranteed. And across the parking lot, as Emily walked away without looking back, the difference between power and control had already been quietly, permanently rewritten. The next morning arrived the same way it always did at Westbrook High, with the low hum of buses pulling into the lot, students gathering in small groups, conversations drifting through the cool air, but beneath that familiar routine, something had shifted in a way no one could fully name. Emily Carter stepped onto campus with the same quiet presence as the day before, her movements unhurried, her expression calm, as if nothing about her had changed, and in truth, nothing had. The difference was not in her. It was in the way the world around her had begun to adjust. As she walked through the front doors, a few conversations softened, not completely, not dramatically, but just enough to notice if you were paying attention. Eyes followed her for a second longer than usual, not with judgment, not with curiosity alone, but with something closer to recognition, the kind that forms after a moment people cannot quite explain, but cannot forget either. Emily did not acknowledge it. She did not need to. She moved through the hallway with the same steady pace, her steps measured, her gaze forward, her silence intact. And yet, that silence no longer felt invisible. Near the lockers, Jake Reynolds stood with his usual group, his posture composed, his presence still strong. But there was a difference now, subtle but undeniable. The easy confidence that once filled the space around him had been replaced with something quieter, something more contained. When he saw Emily approaching, he did not step forward. He did not block her path. He did not speak. Instead, he watched, just for a moment, as she passed by, her presence calm, unaffected, as if the hallway belonged to no one and everyone at the same time. His friends noticed it, even if they did not say it out loud. The absence of action spoke louder than anything he could have done. One of them shifted slightly, glancing between Jake and Emily, waiting for something to happen, for the familiar pattern to return, but it never did. Emily walked past them without hesitation, without acknowledgement, her focus unchanged, her composure steady. And in that simple act, something settled into place, something final. Jake exhaled slowly, his gaze lingering for a fraction of a second longer before he looked away, not defeated, not broken, but different. Because for the first time, he understood something that had never applied to him before. Not every silence is weakness. Some silences are decisions. Around them, the hallway continued to move, students opening lockers, exchanging greetings, stepping into classrooms, the rhythm of the school carrying on as it always had. But beneath that surface, a quiet awareness remained, woven into the space like something learned rather than taught. Emily reached her locker and opened it, the familiar click grounding the moment, her routine unchanged, her presence steady, as if she had never needed anything from anyone in that hallway to begin with. And maybe that was the point. She had not come to prove anything. She had not come to change anyone. She had simply refused to be less than what she already was. Jake adjusted his stance, crossing his arms loosely, his expression neutral as conversations resumed around him. But the way people looked at him had shifted, not drastically, not openly, but enough. Enough to remind him that respect was not something that stayed just because it had always been there. It had to be held, understood, earned in ways he had never needed to consider before. Emily closed her locker and turned toward her next class, her steps as quiet as ever, her presence as composed as ever, but the space she moved through was no longer the same. And that morning, without raising her voice, without making a scene, without needing anyone's approval, she had changed something that no one in that hallway would forget. Because sometimes, the strongest statement is not the one that echoes the loudest, but the one that leaves the deepest silence behind. And that day, the silence said everything.